Greetings, humans. Welcome to this ranking of the Cybermen. In order for this list to be performed adequately, the human known as Tharries was to be upgraded. I believe this video as a result will be far superior to what you would have had otherwise. Make sure to subscribe to this channel or you will be eradicated.
Oh, my head. It's killing. Dennis, why have you moved? Yes, that's right everyone. Today we are going to be remaking a video that I've wanted to redo for quite some time, that being my Cyberman design ranking. The main reasons being that we've had two new Cyberman designs that qualify for this list since I did my last one in around 2020-2021, as well as the fact that I think my previous one is just not that great, and I'd like to go into more detail about what I like and don't like about each individual design. The main qualifiers for this is that we are looking specifically at Cybermen, Cyber Controllers, and Cyber Leaders. So your main Cybermen, so the things like the Cybermats or Cybermites won't be included. Basically, they have to be what a Cyberman normally is, generally speaking, which by my count means that there's 28 Cyberman designs to go through. So without further ado, let's get into the list. Coming in at 28th place, I feel kind of bad for it being last, but there is really no other place it could go. It's the wooden Cyberman from 2013 story, Time of the Doctor. Now, many of you will know Time of the Doctor is one of my favourite stories of the Matt Smith era. I love it as a finale to his Doctor, but as a Cyberman design, the wooden Cyberman is probably my least favourite we've had. What this essentially was in the context of the story was that the Church of the Papal Mainframe was protecting the town called Trenzalore during various invasions to stop the Time Lords returning. So what the Cybermen and other races did was try and think of more low-tech options to get through the technology field surrounding the planet. So what they basically did was, oh, we'll make a Cyberman out of wood. And you know what? Props for creativity. It's a creative idea. However, I do take a couple of issues with it. Obviously, for starters, it's based on the Nightmare and Silver design, which you'll come to learn is not one of my favourites overall, so that immediately puts it at a bit of a disadvantage. There's also just the logistics of this. Like, okay, it's a wooden Cyberman, so does that mean that a person was converted into wood? Or into a wooden shell? Like, how does that work? Also, fitting a flamethrower onto a wooden Cyberman feels very impractical. It makes one wrong move and it's burnt to death, as happens in the story pretty much. I should make it clear now that I don't hate any of the designs on this list really, but at the end of the day something has to go at the bottom and I really couldn't justify putting this any higher. At 27th place we have probably the thing that kind of contradicts with my initial outlining for what a Cyberman is in my initial sort of pitch for this video. We have the Cyber Shades from the next Doctor. These were basically what would happen if cats and dogs got converted into Cybermen. So they are still organic life forms turned into Cybermen of sorts. And like with the wooden Cyberman, part of the problem is it's just an inherently quite a goofy concept. I do like the steampunk faces of these guys. I almost kind of wish that the next Doctor had just gone all out with that and made all the Cybermen steampunk in aesthetic. I think that would have been a really cool visual like novelty and really distinguish this story from the other Cyberman stories in the RTD era, but they unfortunately didn't. I really like that head design though. What really lets this down is basically just the rest of it. The weird feather furry costume thing isn't great, and obviously the fact that it's a man on his all fours, yeah, it just looks a bit goofy, which I get, you know, the next Doctor is meant to be, you know, a goofy story. It was the story that got me into Doctor Who as a kid. So I guess to some degree these guys did their job. But as a Cyberman design itself, you can't really put it above any of the others because it barely even counts as a Cyberman.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
From this point onwards in the list though, we're heading into more sort of normal Cybermen, if that's the right term. These are the guys you look at and go, yep, that's just a normal Cyberman for the most part. Unless you're me and you read too deeply into these things and obsess over little details and analyse them endlessly until no one wants to be your friend anymore and you're left with a crippling state of loneliness as the world turns to mush. Anyway, in 26th place we have the Cybermasters. These are the 2020 versions of these from the episode The Timeless Children. So we're talking big Gallifreyan headdress, robes, grey colouring, or I guess silver, and the droopy faces. And I've always thought these things look very derpy and deviant arty. I really don't like the fact that they wear robes, mainly because They're Cybermen. Why do they need robes? They don't feel cold. I've never seen a Cyberman go,
I wish I brought a coat. It's bloody freezing out here.
no, they're Cybermen. They don't need scarves. They don't need clothes. I think this is also just not helped by the fact that, as I said, conceptually it is quite silly, Time Lord Cybermen. I will say this. The Gallifreyan insignia markings are quite cool. My major issues just come in the fact of the robes, and I also really don't like the more droopy mouths. I think it makes them look a little bit derpy, which, yeah, I'm not a big fan of. But again, I should stress, I don't really hate any of the designs on this list, even the bottom, and this is by no means an exception to that. We haven't had a Cyberman design I've just outright hated, frankly. Next up then, we have the Silver Nemesis Cybermen, named as such because they are the Cybermen that appear in the 1980s story Silver Nemesis, starring Sylvester McCoy, Sophie Aldred, etc. These guys are essentially just what would happen if you put chrome paint on the Earthshock ones, and the thing is, I think the Earthshock design is pretty good. I just don't think the chrome aspect of this has aged particularly well. It looks to me like they wanted to give the Cybermen like a fresh coat of paint, literally, but didn't really have the money to fully commit to it. So what we get as a result is this kind of weird mix-mash of ideas. I'll say as well, the gloves are a bit strange on these guys. Like, the fingers look a bit big for some reason. And yeah, I think the chrome paint is just not something that I think has aged particularly well. Coming up next then at 24th, barely above, we have the Silver Nemesis Cyber Leader. The only real difference between this and the regular Silver Nemesis model is the black handlebars, which I think does just make the design stand out ever so slightly more. And for that, it gets a spot above, but ultimately, everything I had to say negative, or just in general, about this design in the previous listing also applies to this guy. Next up, we have the Wheel in Space Cybermen. Now, I feel like some people are going to be surprised to see these guys so low. Ultimately, for me, they're just a massive step down from what came before and even afterwards, because these are wedged right in between the Moonbase and Tomb designs, which, spoilers, I absolutely love, and the Invasion designs, which I also really enjoy as well. So these guys just sort of look like the awkward middle child of that trio of Trout and Cyberman designs. Oh, I almost had a little bit of alliteration going on there. I don't really like the drop on the mouth. Personally, I think that should just be kept for the eyes only, and the mouth should be left as like a slat. I also don't really like the hands of these guys either, the weird thumbs with like the circular bits at the top. And just the overall body shape and kind of suit looks quite a bit cheaper and a big step down from what we had previously. Not much else to say, just not a big fan of these guys. Coming up next, we have the Revenge of the Cybermen. Cybermen. These are from the Tom Baker story, Revenge of the Cybermen. By the way, feel free to take a drink anytime I say the word Cybermen in this video. Actually, don't, you'll end up dead. But yeah, these guys, I don't mind as much as the Wheel in Space ones. I think the big drawback for me with these guys is the handlebars. They go for a more kind of, what I like to call them is kind of like vacuum cleaner parts on the top of the cyber heads. And I'm not a big fan of that. I think it looks a bit cheap. That tubing also continues all down the body, which I already wasn't a fan of. I don't mind the guns at the top of the heads, they're fine. This is not a design criticism necessarily, but side note, I also just really don't like the way they sound in Revenge of the Cybermen. They're nowhere near as good as the Earthshock voices that would come later. But yeah, ultimately, these guys are not the best, but relatively harmless, I would say. And then, slightly above them, in tradition, we have the leader. The only reason for this is obviously the black handlebars and black head, which is quite a sort of novel thing for Cybermen. Usually, or 9 times out of 10 at least, it is just the handlebars that get the black treatment to indicate that this is the leader. But in this case, they've spray painted the entire head black. And I actually think that that makes it stand out quite a lot more from its counterparts, which I'm glad about because I think this design could have done with something more going on. But yeah, that's why this guy goes slightly above. In 20th place, we have the Talos Cyber Controller from Attack of the Cybermen, the 6th Doctor story. What this essentially is an Earthshock Cyberman with a head design more in keeping with the Tomb Cyber Controller from the 1960s story with the sort of Squidward-shaped head, and also not to slag off the guy who was controlling the design at the time, or the costume at the time, but this Cyberman is a bit bulkier than some of the others, so overall, I think this design, whilst fine, and whilst mostly in keeping with the Earthshock designs, so therefore it's not too low, it is, at the same time, not quite as good as those for the weird-looking Squidward type head and the more sort of bulky body. It's just not quite as menacing and a little bit more goofy looking in my personal opinion, but I still enjoy this one for what it is. Next up, we have our first mainline new series design, and I'm going to go for the Nightmare and Silver ones. Look, I delayed putting these on this list as long as I could, but I can't really delay putting them off much more. The main issue with these guys, and it's kind of a deal breaker for me, but they basically lose all of their, like, human qualities, because part of the Cybermen's appeal is that they're meant to look like humanity 2.0. What if we took ourselves and bonded with machinery and became these disturbed, contorted, uncanny valley creatures? And I just don't get that from these Cybermen. These Cybermen to me look like what would happen if Apple designed the Cybermen. They kind of have like a weird Iron Man thing going on. I do actually like the arc reactor in the middle, which has actually been carried over into future designs, which we'll get to. And the one thing I would say I prefer in these guys over, say, the Cybers designs, for instance, would be the fact that they're a bit more slender and a bit more, I guess, anatomically. They feel a bit more like just humans in suits rather than these big bulky things. However, I also think that's kind of their flaw. They're almost too perfect. They don't feel like something humanity has, like, been forced to make. And I get that these Cybermen were also part of, you know, a big intergalactic cyber war, so it makes sense for them to be that advanced, but I don't know, I'm just not a big fan. The headpieces are quite cool though. In 18th place, we have the 12th Cyber Legion Cybermen. So you might be somewhat confused by this placement, because to the naked eye, these just look like the Cybermen that were introduced in the early RTD era, and that's essentially what these boys are. The major difference is, as you'll notice, the centerpiece doesn't have the big C. And the narrative justification for this, well, at least from some writers, is that the 12th Cyber Legion are basically the Cybermen who eventually merged with the Mondasian ones and became more advanced, hence why in the Moffat era you get spacefaring Cybermen. So that's why they look like the Cybers ones, but minus the C, because they were not made by Cybers Industries. With that having been said, the major thing I dislike about these guys is their lack of the C. I know some people think that the C looks a bit tacky because C Cybermen. Personally, I just think it looks like something's missing when you remove it. It looks like something was meant to be there that was removed. And I don't know, it's just something about it doesn't quite sit right with me personally. I think it would have looked better actually if they'd have used the arc reactor type format from the Nightmare and Silver Cybermen, as you could kind of show how one became the other sort of thing. But I digress. They're fine though for the most part. And then just above that we have the 12th Cyber Legion Leader. What this essentially is the leader variant of the Cyberman, but again, minus the C. This is notable for having an all-black faceplate as opposed to just black handlebars, which does make it unique, along with its brain inside its head, which was previously seen in the Cyber Controller, which we'll get to at some point. But yeah, the only reason this is here is because the lack of a C. And then in 17th place is the Victorian Cyber Leader, the Cyber Leader that's literally identical to the previous one, except it now has the C. So yeah, all the things I said about the previous one still apply. I do prefer it when it is just the handlebars on my Cyber Leaders personally, but I do think the faceplate is a nice novelty, along with the brain, and I wouldn't mind seeing a variant like this again. In 15th place then, we have the Stealth Cyberman, also from Attack of the Cybermen. These were essentially what they are on the tin. In the story, we have a variant of Cybermen that were designed for stealth, so they're essentially Earthshock Cybermen painted black, and it's a pretty cool design. You know, I definitely prefer it to the Silver Nemesis silver versions of this design. This is a one-off and it doesn't really appear very much, so it's hard to rank it much higher than this, but as a variant I do quite enjoy it. In 14th place we have the Cyber Controller. Man, these names are getting hard to say. This is from Age of Steel specifically. It's when John Lumick gets converted into a Cyberman and his chair gets converted alongside it. and as he was the creator of the Cybermen in this universe, he's dubbed the controller with the brain in his head, as well as the glowy eyes, which I think makes him look really unique, as well as his throne, which is emblematic of the wheelchair, which he does eventually step out of later in the story. I love the voice of this guy, the kind of deeper, more menacing voice that Nick Briggs does for him, even though that's not necessarily a design thing. And this guy also has, as I said before, the brain thing. But yeah, overall this design is pretty cool. It's just sort of a Cybers one with some extra bells and whistles, so it goes here. In 13th place, the newest Cyberman so far, I've gone with the Cyber Master from the Power of the Doctor, the Black Varian. So this keeps the Gallifreyan headrobe from the original Cybermaster design, but as you can see, design-wise, they have been repainted to be black. The Gallifreyan insignias are still intact. The mouths have been made less droopy and more angry looking. And overall, I think this is just a major step up on the previous Cybermaster design. The headdress still does look a bit goofy in my mind, hence why it's not higher. However, I definitely prefer this to what we saw previously, and I think it does a good job in distinguishing the Cybermasters, or the Time Lord Cyberman variants, from the original Cybermen, seeing as both are seen in Power of the Doctor. But yeah, I really like black variants for Cybermen in general, to be fair, as like little one-offs. So yeah, these are pretty cool. And then, in keeping with that theme, just above them, we have the Cyber Warrior Black variant, again from Power of the Doctor. These are basically the same thing as the Cyber Warriors, the regular ones, except in black instead of grey, and have the Gallifreyan markings as well. I think, again, the markings make these guys look really cool too, and I love the effects when they're regenerating too. I think that looks really cool, and how the regeneration effect seems to come out of the orb in the middle. I think that looks really cool. The arc reactor in the middle, I think that's really cool. I just prefer my Cybermen without the Gallifreyan headdress things. That's why these go higher than the Cybermaster equivalent, which is basically the leader version of the Time Lord Cybermen. I'd also say as well, as far as I could tell, neither of these guys had clothes, which was one of my big issues with the original Cybermaster design. So again, that puts these majorly above their previous iterations. Actually, tell a lie, as I was editing this video, I realised that the Cybermasters in Power of the Doctor have capes as opposed to scarves in the original story, which is technically a form of clothing. However, I still prefer that to the scarves they were wearing in the original story, so my point still stands that these are still an improvement, even though the Warrior versions still go ahead because they do have no clothes. Listen, I know I made a mistake, but when you've been talking about Cybermen for about half an hour, eventually everything starts to become a bit blurry in your head. In 11th place, we have the Cyber Warriors. These are the main Cyberman designs for the Chibnall era, first appearing in Ascension of the Cybermen, and I do like them quite a bit. As I'm sure you can tell, they maintain the sort of arc reactor thing from the Nightmare and Silver design, but they have much bulkier frames like the Cybers ones, as well as more 80s shaped heads. Their face shape looks a lot more similar to the likes of the Earthshock Cybermen to me, which is a big plus. My one sort of critique of these guys, and it's something that I think you either really like or you really don't, is the spikes. I get that they're meant to be warrior variants of the Cybermen. Personally, I've always found the spikes just a little bit overkill. Personally, I'd love to see a version of these Cybermen minus the spikes. In fact, if they got rid of those, they might even chart above the Cybers ones for me, possibly, as I kind of prefer the more retro vibe of these ones, but as it stands, they remain in 11th place, but definitely one of the better designs of New Who in my opinion. It's just a shame really that we only really got to see them in fleeting, and they were often paired up with other variants, be them the original Cybermasters, the new Cybermasters, or in very brief cameos during Flux. These guys never really got their time to shine, which I think is a shame. Although maybe RTD will keep them around for his era, who knows. Next up, as we break into the top 10, we have the Cybermen. Yeah, so I've spoken about these guys quite a bit in this list already, it feels like, and that's because there are a lot of variants to these boys, but the original boys are still really cool. They have a more bulky design than some of the other versions of the Cybermen that we've gone over on this list, and I think that works for the story that these guys tell. Obviously, they're initially introduced in Rise of Cybermen Age of Steel as human-made Cybermen from a parallel Earth, and I think as that, they make sense. The more bolted, unfinished kind of design kind of makes them look more like they've been man-made on some sort of assembly line. As I said, I like the Cybers logo myself personally. I think the stomping did become a bit overbearing later, but I think early on it gives them a unique sort of mode of transportation, if you like. It makes them unique when they're moving around. My one major critique with these guys would just be that you don't really see much of the human conversion aspect of the Cybermen, which is kind of the same for most new Who designs, which is why some of them are lower than some of the classic Who designs, because I feel like you see more of the human elements in some of those other designs. But I do still enjoy the original Cyber's design quite a bit. I'd also say that the mouth glowing blue is a big plus, and I kind of hope they bring something like that back, just so it's easier to tell when a Cyberman is talking, especially when it's dark and stuff. I think that's a neat little touch. But yeah, overall, a really nice design, just not my favourite. As we get to this point in the list, it's very much like semantics, you know, it's just little things. In 9th place, we have the Cybus Cyber Leader. This is basically just the Cybus Cyberman again, but the leader form. So it has the black handlebars, and again, much like with previous leader variations, I just think the black handlebars make these boys stand out ever so slightly more, and we mostly see these in Army Against Doomsday, and yeah, they work really well. They're basically just the Cybus ones with black handlebars. Not much more to say, just really solid design. In 8th place, ooh, I feel like this might be controversial. I've gone for the Earthshock ones. Now, I know that reception of these boys can be a little bit hit and miss. I know some people really love them, and some people think they look a bit goofy. I can see why people would think that they're a bit goofy and a bit 80s, but to me, that adds to the charm. I love the giant boiler suits and their massive heads. I mean, I've got one of those in my collection, for God's sake. You know, I really do like these heads and this design. Their voices as well, it's not necessarily a design feature, but they are iconic in their own right. They're just iconic, you know, even if they're not always perfect in the way that they're presented, and perhaps are a little bit too emotive for Cybermen, I still really enjoy these boys. It probably also helps that they have some really good classic Who outings, particularly things like Earthshock, which is just a really good episode. And David Banks' performance as the Cyber Leader, in particular, is incredible, and it kind of forces these guys to be as iconic as they are. I also love these guys' weapons, like the cyber guns. Those are like the best versions of like cyber guns that we've ever had. I know I haven't really spoken about guns in this video, but these are definitely the guys who carry the best guns, if that's something you're interested in. Speaking of the Earthshock Leader, he is next. Again, you know the drill. Black handlebars, iconic voice, David Banks being amazing. What more can be said? Incredible work. Probably the most iconic individual Cyberman of the entire show, just through the voice and the performance. Yeah, incredible stuff. In 6th place, we have the Invasion Cybermen. Now, these guys, I think, have gone up in my estimations from the previous ranking. I haven't rewatched the ranking that I did last time prior to doing this one, but I used to think that they were a bit, not cheap, but kind of lesser than some of the other designs because of the zip in the middle, but actually, the more I look at them, the more I like their sleekness and their simplicity. And I really like their head designs as well. Their head designs are probably most similar to the Revenge Cybermen, but they don't have the sort of vacuum handlebars, which is one of my big issues with those ones. I also think that their central chest piece is quite nice as well, the sort of bulkier chest unit I like. And I like that, as opposed to the Talos Cybermen, which we'll cover later, these guys have fully opposable hands as opposed to the little weird claw things that the Tomb Cybermen have. These guys are just a really nice rendition of the Cybermen from the 60s and their final major rendition in the 60s, and they go out on a strong note, certainly. I think their more sleek design almost certainly helped with public shooting as well. Now we're into the top 5, and we're going for the original 10th planet Cybermen. So these are obviously the very first Cybermen we're ever acquainted with, and what an impression they make just right off the bat. The huge bulking chest unit. I love that the hands are visible on these guys. I think that's a really cool bit of body horror that we've yet to see replicated in a Cyberman design since this design. The huge boots are really cool, the massive headlight on the Cyberman's head. It all is a really, really nice bit of 60s design. The only thing I would say lets this down slightly is budgetary restrictions of the time. I would say that the face masks look a bit inconsistent and funny looking at points. The voices are also super iconic, of course. And yeah, overall, I love these guys to bits. Considering when they were made, I think they hold up really, really well. A fact that's only exemplified by a later inclusion in the list, but we haven't got there yet. In 4th place, to my surprise, we have Ashad, the lone Cyberman. So Ashad was a one-off Cyberman who was introduced in The Haunting in Villa Diodati, who was one of the very few people who willingly took cyber conversion and sees the Cybermen as superior to humanity. And what's super interesting about that is that his conversion wasn't ever fully completed, hence why his face is still visible, and parts of his design look like a mix mash from different eras. You've got the arc reactor, which is from more modern Cyberman designs, but then you've got certain bits like the arms that look more like Mondasian ones, and you could even see, like, you know, bits of hand and stuff. Basically, what I love about these guys, kind of like with the 10th Planet ones, is you can see that these were once humans, in the same way that with the 10th Planet ones, you can see the hands. Being able to see parts of a face in a Cyberman, even if it's, you know, in a cracked helmet, is a really, really cool design, a really bit of cool visual work. And in Haunting especially, he is a really cool threat. It's a shame that as time went on, he kind of just became a generic leader. It's unfortunate because I think the concept of someone who willingly took cyber conversion and saw it as the next step and actually really liked being a Cyberman, I guess, is a cool idea, which never really got its full time in the oven, which I think you could kind of say for a lot of Chibnall era ideas. But nonetheless, I really do like Ashad from a design standpoint. I would like to see more half-converted or partially converted Cybermen in the future. I think that's a really cool design idea. In third place, and I'm really showing my bias here, we have the Tomb Cyber Leader. So this is, as I said, the leader from the story Tomb of the Cybermen. This is kind of the first version of the leader that has the bigger, more overly shaped head, as well as the very first to feature the brain at all in a Cyberman design, which, as I said previously, kind of became a staple in future leader and controller designs. I love this Cyberman design though. It's basically just the Tomb ones with those little flourishes, and it also has a more sleek body, and yeah, it's just really cool. Its voice is absolutely fantastic as well. The Talos ones have my favourite voices as well, and I love that their mouthpiece, it moves up and down as they speak. I think that adds to the sort of automated, roboticized feel of these guys. Yeah, really, really solid design. A really timeless and elegant leader, and one of my personal favourites. So that's why it goes in number 3. In second place, we have the World Enough in Time colony ship Mondasian Cybermen. So these are essentially the 10th Planet ones that were updated for the 2017 story World Enough in Time / The Doctor Falls. And what these guys basically do is they take that original 10th Planet design and improve them just enough to make them fit within the modern show in a really cool way. They make the masks more uniform and consistent across all of the designs. They maintain the voices pretty close. They keep the big headlamp on the top, which I loved. The only thing that I missed from the 10th Planet design that's absent here is they replaced the open hands that made the 10th Planet designs so sort of haunting and so Uncanny Valley and so human-esque with the gloves, which I get kind of why they did it. But to me personally, I think the hands are a much more haunting image, and I'd have much preferred they keep that. But regardless, this is still a major step up in every way from the 10th Planet versions. Just a really sleek update of the 10th Planet design that keeps their core the same, you know, their faces are basically the same, but just refines everything enough for modern audiences. And personally, I wouldn't have even minded if these were the default Cybermen moving forwards. I think they would have looked more than great, but you know, we've got new Cybermen since then. But yeah, these guys are still phenomenal, and I'd love to see them again in another New Who story. I'd like to give an honourable mention at this point to the Cyber War Cybermen. I'm not really sure what to call these guys. Basically, it's kind of been established that during Ascension of the Cybermen, you see a bunch of floating Cybermen that died during the Cyber Wars that seem to have the Cyber Warrior body and the Cyber's head, and I don't really know where to put this, because we've never had a full-on look at these guys, but we know that they exist through that story, so I thought I'd mention them here. I've made a little mock-up. It probably doesn't look too great, and I apologise for that, but I thought I'd make it an honourable mention here, just so that I could say that I've technically talked about every single little Cyberman variant that there is, not including Big Finish and stuff, because that would be an even longer video. But yeah, there's an honourable mention for those of you who are wondering. But without further ado, in first place, to no one's surprise if you know me, it's the two moon-based ones. Now don't get me wrong, are they perfect? Probably not. As I said, the little sort of tennis-y balls that they have on their bodies probably haven't aged the best, and they have 3 fingers, which I actually quite like, because they're actually from a different planet to Mondas, so they're not technically derivative of humans necessarily, so I don't mind that too much, even though I think that the Invasion Cybermen using 5-fingered Cybermen was probably the right way to go. I still think this gives them a unique vibe of their own. I just love the faces of these guys, I love the overall design, I love the chest units, I love the heads, the eyes, the mouth slot again does the up and down thing, which I love. Again, they're not perfect, and I think another element of this is definitely down to like childhood nostalgia, as these guys were my first Cybermen, but I do really enjoy this design, and I would love to see what a sort of World Enough Time equivalent for these guys would be. You know, a modern dressing up of these guys for the new series. Bring back the Talos Cybermen, that would be really cool. But yeah, these have always been my favourite. I absolutely love them from top to bottom. All the different wiring on them I think is really cool as well. And yeah, I just love this design. What more can I say? But that about wraps up this ranking. Let me know if you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below how you rank all the Cybermen. This will be my first video of 2023, so I hope you did enjoy it. As you can tell, lighting is new because things are changing around here. Production values are going up. I also wanted to give a huge thank you to Adam Walker VFX for his new work on basically the rebrand. A new intro will be coming in the next video, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. But yeah, I put a lot of effort into this video, as you can see, so I hope you did enjoy. Be sure to subscribe if you're new, it really helps out the channel. Like if you enjoyed, and I will see you later.